Brad Newcombe, and you're watching Pressure Point. Since Stockwell Day was elected leader of the Alliance Party, there's been a great deal of discussion about his own personal faith and how that might or might not impact government policy if he was elected and formed a government. And as Canadians, we've watched for many years as American politicians trot out their personal faith as almost a prerequisite for holding public office. Well, with me to talk about the link between faith and politics, I have two politicians who are also two ordained United Church ministers. And I'm very happy to welcome the Reverend John Cashore, NDP MLA, and the Reverend Val Anderson, a Liberal MLA.
That's right.
Good to have both of you here. And want to find a little bit about the links between faith and politics. First of all, perhaps, is it similar being a minister and being a politician? John?
There are a lot of similarities. For instance, part of being a minister, if you're in a pastorate, is to speak to the congregation, and you speak to the people in preparing a sermon, and you do that in politics in various contexts, whether it's in the constituency or in the legislature. Another similarity is that a lot of people come to you for help, and they wouldn't normally do that except they're desperate. And the MLA office has become very similar to my recollections of a United Church office, where often the office staff in the church are having to deal with really difficult problems of people coming in, say on a Friday afternoon, their welfare check has run out. That happens in MLA offices too. And MLAs and ministers of the church are expected to be advocates for people. And so, yes, there are similarities.
Now, Val, when you were thinking of running for public office as a politician, did your faith, what role did it have in making that decision?
Well, within the ministry, as part of my expression of faith, as John said, you're out with people in the community. And when I was out with people in the community, one of the things we discovered is that governments were making decisions that hindered the people to have their freedom, and so you were going to government trying to get them to change, and when they didn't change, then you worked on changing government. And so that's how I got involved on behalf of the people. And the first visit I had as an MLA was an elderly couple. He was 80 and she was 85, and she was bedridden and had oxygen tanks on her, and they called me to the house because they couldn't come to the office because they needed daycare and they needed help. And so it was the same visit I would have done as a minister.
So they called you as an MLA, and you made a house call as an MLA to hear their concerns.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, is that unusual for do most MLAs do that, or is that's like, I would never in my wildest imagination think of calling up MLA and expect them to come to buy the house. Do you do that?
Yes, as a matter of fact, there's been an evolution over time in the role of the MLA, and we have a provincial ombudsman, which is an office that adjudicates the application of fairness in public policy. But in a way, every MLA's office is a mini ombudsman's office, because people come to that office and say, I don't think I'm being treated fairly. And quite often it's not a large political thing. It's a matter that when the MLA's office or the MLA phones the bureaucrat, phones the deputy minister, that call is returned almost immediately.
And, I would wish they would return the call immediately.
I must say, by the way, I just want to say to the two of you too, in terms of arranging for the two of you to be here, you've been two of the most accessible people I've ever contacted. I mean, many people are, but I mean, just immediately accessible, and if not, immediately return the call. So I just want to say that. I mean, just so impressed.
Well, people come to us, as John says, because they have, in trying to work with government, whatever, whether it's ICB, insurance, or whether it's workman's compensation, or whether it's welfare, or whatever it is,
pensions.
When everything else fails and they can't get anybody and the doors are all closed, then they come to us.
Yeah. So the ordained ministry is often seen as a calling. Do you see a vocation, and one feels called? Do you feel called to be in public office as a member of the Legislative Assembly?
The vast majority of people who become MLAs either have a calling that they want to do things on behalf of their people in the community, out of their experience, or in many cases the people of the community have come to them and said, we would want you to act on our behalf. And a lot of the MLAs are there, not because they thought of it, but because somebody came to them and said, we need you to represent us.
So in that sense, that's being called.
Right.
That's right.
Through
That's being
the
called.
people. People are saying, we think you can do this.
Yep.
And I think historically that often clergy people are people that have been recognized by others of having some of the attributes that they would like to see in a politician. And perhaps that's just because those are public people as well, and so people have seen them in contexts where they've been working on problem solving in the community. Maybe we saw that more in the past in the days of Stanley Knowles and J.S. Woodsworth and Tommy Douglas, but we still, there's quite a tradition throughout Canadian politics.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to talk about too, was because we look to our neighbors to the south and think that their politicians do sort of trot out this faith in God. And I think some of it's probably very sincere, and some of it may be a little bit inclined to get votes and so on. But we do have a long history of a link between faith and politics in Canada. But I mean, many people don't know. I mean, I was talking to someone just recently about this program and was talking about Tommy Douglas. I said, well, of course, Tommy Douglas was a minister.
Yeah.
And they just, really? So are we hiding our light under the bushel, so to speak? I mean, how public do you make your own faith pronouncements? I mean, because many people may see your names in the papers, and if it doesn't say Reverend, they have no idea that you're guided and motivated by faith.
Well, I think there's a variety of ways of describing faith. A lot of people today will use the term values rather than faith, and that there are values that are expressed. And even today, as recently in the Trudeau's funeral, there was a description of the faith which gave him the values, which gave him the vision of working on behalf of the people.
Right.
And so I find every politician has a vision and values that are connected to it.
Do you think that we in Canada need to articulate that more clearly so that people see those roots from which it comes? And maybe Stockwell Day has done that or is doing that.
He's done it in one sense. What Canada has, though, in a way that other countries don't, is that we have a multi-faith and multicultural country.
Right.
And the faith and the cultures are highlighted in our country for all of the faith groups.
Yeah,
and I think that's important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm not sure if your question is should people who are Christians or members of the clergy, when they are expressing, when they're doing their thing as a politician,
right,
should they be talking about in a very public way about their faith and how this informs this process? And I think there are ways of doing that aren't offensive, but I think we have to remember that when we are in that arena, we are there to represent all the people in our constituency, all the different great groups that make up the multicultural nature of our country and our land. And therefore, it's, in a sense, it's something like, well, people will be known by their fruits, by what they do, but I don't think it's the type of thing where it's appropriate to be kind of wearing it on one's sleeve and saying that the reason I believe this is because this defines my faith as a member of the United Church of Canada. Right. Or if you do reference that, I think it's important to be sensitive about how you go about doing that so that you don't leave an impression of some kind of an inappropriate sense of superiority or something that should not be conveyed.
So in other words,
prior to being in politics, I was coordinator with Canadian Multi-Faith Action. So that for 11 years of my life, I worked in a multi-faith context with all of the faith groups. So it's no different what I'm doing now than what I was doing then. And each of the people involved in that were sharing with each other their faith and learning from each other. And that's what the multi-faith. Faith is important. But no,
faith is important, but not like, George W. Bush, George Bush Jr., in the campaign leading up to the presidential election was hearing about when he was campaigning for the Republican leadership, was asked who his favorite philosopher was, and he said Jesus Christ, because Jesus captured his heart. And then, of course, he was criticized then by some for playing what they would call the Jesus card.
Yeah. Well, there is an aspect in politics that when your career's on the ascendancy and you're trying to make a name for yourself, quite often people will advise you and say, well, you should play this card because that's going to help you. Just as with the debates that Val was referring to, there would be all kinds of advisors saying if you get a chance in that debate, you should say such and such. Now, so probably when it happens that way, as you say, playing the card, I don't think it's appropriate myself. I think, in fact, I think it's wrong, and I don't think it has a place in politics.
But however, it has a place. You have to be honest to yourself, like everybody else has to be honest to themselves. And you need to do it, as John says, in a way that invites other people to come with the same honesty about who they are and the values from which they come. So you meet together. You don't hide from it. That's not being honest, to hide from who you are or why you're there.
Let me give you another example. I respect and honor the right of anybody to be seen carrying their Bible into church on Sunday morning.
Right.
But when President Clinton carries his Bible into church on Sunday morning, that becomes a news story. And that's okay too. I'm not opposed to that. But the fact was, you can't stop the speculation that goes on in a lot of people's minds when they see that happening in the context of some of the news that has surrounded him over the last few years.
Right.
So that's one of the realities you have to be aware of when you do that.
Well, if you try to say by the expression of your faith that you're better than somebody else, then that's a false expression of anybody's faith. If you're saying that your faith relates you on an equal basis to other people and them to you, then that's because we do need values.
Yeah. And as you say, gives people a sense of values, and then that leads to a vision for the kind of community and society that we want to have, which then raises the question that you're always faced with the demands of a party, and in your case, the governing party, but also a party that is, wants to take control of the government, and there will be policies that we don't all agree with. How do you deal with things that the party or the government may be espousing, or directions they may move in, and maybe there's other Christians, they're not clergy and so on in the government? How do any of you deal with it when you question the moral or religious grounds that this is based on?
The same way any employee deals with his boss in any business, in the decision that boss makes.
Okay.
Whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in education, whether it's in manufacturing or selling cars. There are ways you do it, and morality is involved in every one of those.
Right.
And there are decisions and balances. So it's no different from my point of view in politics than it is in any business.
John?
Well, I think I understand what you're saying, Val, but it is sometimes difficult for people to confront their boss if they feel something's happening that is not right. And so that quite often is a moment of standing up and being counted. But I think that one of the things that is really important is that if you have the privilege of being an elected member, and if you don't have a fundamental respect for the other parties in the House and where they're coming from, and the fact that the view that is being expressed over there may not be my view, but I respect the background from which that view is presented, because if that fundamental respect is not there, and I think sometimes in modern politics it appears not to be there, but if it's not there, then I think we do get into a kind of a moral superiority which doesn't serve any valuable purpose at all. When you ask the question about does your faith, is there a link between faith and politics, I'd say yes, and I'd also say I think everybody has a faith. I would say some people have a faith in atheism, and it's important for me to respect that people have a faith in those things that, in a sense, that make them tick. And we have to start with that fundamental respect in order, so that we can then engage in sometimes very divergent opinions about policy. But I think if we don't have that fundamental respect there, then it doesn't really serve.
And it's in that
purpose.
dialogue of engagement that the different points of view are brought forth, so that the public could look at the issue, whatever it may be, from a variety of points of view, all of which come at it with a set of beliefs and faiths. The old illustration of you're seeing an accident from four corners. You see four different accidents.
Yeah.
It's that dialogue, particularly now when we televise it, which is important.
Now let's take a particular issue, because that makes it easy to understand. Let's take the issue of gambling, casinos, gambling, and so on, which is sort of has become kind of pervasive in our society, and which the Christian denomination from which you're a part, the United Church of Canada, and myself as well, has taken some very strong stands, on gambling. How have you dealt with that within your own parties, within the government, and have the people in your party been interested in your religious views?
Well, you see, in my case, I've been fortunate because in my particular case in our party, we have been against any extension of gambling, totally. Right. So that made it easier for me because that's my stance.
Right, okay.
So I haven't had to, in other issues we have divided and we have voted differently.
Now, what are some of the other issues that you've sort of
Well, abortion would be one of the issues that people have voted differently on.
Right.
Gay rights would
benefits.
be another one, would be one in which we in our party have voted differently on the issue.
Now, how does that work in terms of, is there a pressure to vote one way, or are people encouraged to vote according to their religious and moral grounds?
But I think in order to really get behind this issue, it's important to look at what happens in our democratic system in the caucus and the various perspectives that are taken. I mean, I would disagree a little bit with Val that his party was really solid on that issue. I think if we looked at some of their literature prior to that, and the fact that the
and we'll be watching. We'll be watching if you're elected too. We will be watching.
The fact
John
that the casino
before we got into politics.
I know.
But the fact that that they were the ones that received the large donations from the casino organization. We didn't. And I think it was well known that there were people like me there that were very adamant against the gaming expansion. And this was
I'll ask you to give me a verse and where that, I know you say that, but I'd like you to document that for me, because I don't believe what you've said, and I have to be clear because you've made a statement and I don't believe it. I didn't believe it when you said it in the House, and I won't accept it here.
No, it was J.C. Schaefer's organization made a donation, and that was documented, and so that was documented, and I'm quite prepared to say the name of where that donation came from. It was her organization. Anyway, I think that when you go behind the scenes, you have to realize that in a caucus, there are discussions that take place. And those discussions are often a very strong disagreement, just as you'll have between government and opposition. And but in our system, when you become a politician in our system, you accept that process, which means that you have a caucus, you have government policy, you have the opposition caucus and their policy, and they hammer out a policy behind closed doors, as does government, and then that emanates forth in the positions that are taken. Now, 95% of the time, really, there is not a disagreement. But the high-profile issues are the ones where there is.
Well, and I would expect that there should be some disagreement.
And I agree with John, there's that discussion. But there's also a difference in point of view. And we in our caucus, on a number of issues, have voted differently in our caucus. And will continue to do so, because we think on the moral issues, the really value issues, that everybody has to speak for themselves and for the constituents.
Now,
as a caucus,
that's a good example. On Meech Lake, for instance, I was one of 5 people in our caucus that did not vote with our caucus. And so those things do happen from time to time.
And that's the way it should be. And that's where faith, but you see, those decisions are not always based on faith.
Right.
Those can be based on prejudice as well.
Of course.
So you can't always say that they're faith issues where you have disagreements. They can be prejudices also.
Right.
Because we're still human, regardless of where our background is.
Right. Would you, with this sort of conversation, which sort of, I think, Stockwell Day sort of precipitated it with the media, and the media sort of goes along. I mean, it seems like one of those things they're interested in. And there is a lot more discussion about the role of faith in public life in Canadian politics. Is that something that you would like to see articulated sort of to a greater and greater extent, so that people do make those connections, or would you rather see it sort of left sort of a little subtler?
In a multi-faith
understated?
society, it has to come to the fore, because unless we can understand the faith of the people that we live and work with, we don't understand the philosophical thinking, or we don't understand where they come in their basis of decision making. And that's, as John knows well, that's true with the Aboriginal people. Unless we understand the spiritual content of the Aboriginal concerns, then we can't deal with the physical issues.
One of the things as a politician that I miss is the public dialogue being engaged by the faith communities that I don't see happening as much now as it was in the past. For instance, it used to be that you couldn't open up a newspaper without seeing J.R. Muchmore or Ray Hord or some of the people of 30 years ago commenting on the moral quality of life within our country, and that would inspire a dialogue that would then take on a life of its own. Mm-hmm. Now, for the working politician, I think that dialogue is very helpful, but often I think that the faith communities have a role that they don't fulfill perhaps quite as much as I would like them to fulfill, because I think that type of dialogue needs to engage the public. And the funeral of Trudeau has people talking about the social safety net again. And I think it was almost forgotten. But now people are talking about it.
That's right. Yeah. So would you then encourage faith communities, and that would be Christian and other than Christian,
Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, whatever.
Would you encourage them then to sort of make petitions to bring their voice to the government to be welcomed to the table?
Not only bring it to government, but bring it to each other, and come collectively to the government. Like not vying against each other, but working together.
Does the government listen? Because I've heard it said that the government doesn't listen anymore. That faith issues are just so trivial, they're off to the side that they don't listen.
Well, I don't think that's true. I think that I think that both the leader of the opposition and the premier can cite times when they have sought the input of the various faith communities, and I know that. Prior to the Nishka agreement going through, that the faith communities made very strong statements to government, showing their research on the issue and what their expectations were. And government doesn't always respond in the way that those communities may wish, but I think if that's not out there and if that dialogue isn't out there, then things are happening in a vacuum. And when it's not being discussed by the general society, people are less knowledgeable of the factors that go into a decision, whether they agree with it or not. So I think that the faith community has a role there.
And they have another role, because the faith community is where, within their religious meetings, their worship, their discussion groups, is where they talk about the issues of the community. They talk about the poverty, they talk about the food bank, they talk about homelessness. And the faith communities are very strong and have been continuously over the generations giving the lead in tackling those issues and challenging the governments, federal and provincial, to do that, and they should continue to do that even more so.
And certainly the faith communities are also the communities that sometimes are as much in touch with that as any other group in a community, because often when people are desperate, one of the first places they do go to is the church or the mosque or the synagogue, because there are not many other places that welcome people as easily, and certainly the access is there, at least. Whether you get the service or the needs met, I'm not sure, but certainly the access is there.
Right.
Now, as people...
But historically, the faith communities have set up the hospitals, they set up the educational systems, they've set up the social welfare programs. Historically in our country, the faith communities have been fundamental to the ground being of society, and we need to continue to do that.
And I also think that we need to sort of tell that story a little more, because I know that there are a whole generation of people that have no idea that the churches had any role, or the Christian faith, or that other faith groups had any role in the development of those institutions and sort of services. Just as we don't have a lot of time left, just a few minutes, I want to ask you, as people of faith, as two men of faith, now that you've been in politics for some time, and you were also in Christian ministry as ordained ministers, how do you see politics? Because there is a cynicism out there about politicians and politics, and it's kind of discouraging sometimes. How would you see the role that you and your colleagues play in our culture, society?
Well, I'm absolutely convinced that politics is an honorable profession.
Right.
I think there is an entertainment aspect to media coverage which seeks to focus on the polarization, which I think where there's disagreement, that is newsworthy, of course. But I think it gives a distorted picture of what's really happening. I think if anybody could be a fly on the wall and see what goes on in a Liberal caucus meeting or an NDP caucus meeting, they would see theological discussions breaking out. They would hear people talking about we should do this because it's the right thing to do, even though there will be a downside in terms of political consequences. And from my perspective, where I sit, I am saddened that politicians rate very low in opinion polls, because I don't think that is a deserved rating, and I think it's because people aren't aware of the hours of work and the depth of concern that goes into the work.
And the vision.
What has happened, though, is there's been a separation of the politicians from the people. We have to come back together so the people and the politicians are working much more closely together, and we're moving in that direction all around the world, not just here, so that there's more decision-making of which the people are a part of, and the new internets and the other things are going to make that possible.
And of course that is changing everything too. I mean,
That's
continually.
right.
I mean, just as the issues sort of change and evolve, the ways in which we discuss them changes as well.
Yeah, and so the opportunities for the politicians to work with the people with the politicians on a daily basis is very important.
Well, we're out of time, but I want to thank you both so much for, first of all, being here and also being so accessible. I just think you're terrific. I mean, just so impressed with the fact that, just within hours, just be in touch. So thanks for talking to me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Talking with Reverend John Cashore and also Reverend Val Anderson, two United Church ministers, and they're also two elected politicians, one NDP and the other Liberal. Thanks for joining us on Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe.